The champagne flute shattered against marble. Silence swallowed the ballroom whole. Han Joon-Okoye did not blink. He did not breathe. Across 200 guests in silk and diamonds, a woman in a catering uniform knelt among broken glass, her dark eyes lifting to meet his, and something inside his chest, something he had buried beneath 7 years of ice and blood, cracked open like a wound that never healed. He had sworn on his mother's grave he would never let a woman destroy him again. The vow dissolved in a single heartbeat. Before we continue this journey of obsession, power, and a love that was never supposed to exist, please like, share, and subscribe. Rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Lotte World Tower's 76th floor. Seoul glittered below like a circuit board dipped in gold, every bridge and highway pulsing with light that could not reach the storm above. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers threw fractured rainbows across 200 of South Korea's most powerful bodies. Ministers, chaebol heirs, tech magnates whose names trended on Naver every morning. They laughed behind champagne flutes and pretended they had not all come for one reason. Him. Blessing John balanced a silver tray of canapés between her palms and tried to make herself invisible. The catering uniform, black slacks, white button-down, burgundy vest, scratched at her collarbone. Her hair was pinned so tightly beneath a hairnet that her temples throbbed. She kept her eyes on the floor. She had learned over the last 3 years that invisibility was survival. 3 years ago, she had attended galas like this one in Lagos. She had worn emerald silk and her mother's diamond earrings. She had danced with senators' sons and laughed behind her hand at jokes she did not find funny. That life had burned to ash before she turned 26. Now she served hors d'oeuvres to strangers who looked through her as though she were glass. She did not resent them. Resentment required energy she could not afford. A Korean businessman in a navy suit reached past her without acknowledgement, plucking a smoked salmon blini from her tray. His cufflink caught her wrist. She flinched. He did not notice. She exhaled through her nose and continued walking. The ballroom hummed with orchestrated elegance. A string quartet played Debussy near the ice sculpture. Waiters moved in synchronized lines. Every detail had been curated by a PR firm whose retainer cost more than Blessing's annual rent. The event was a charity gala for the Han Joon-Okoye Foundation, a name that made billionaires straighten their ties and politicians rehearse their smiles. Blessing had not known who Han Joon-Okoye was when she accepted the catering shift. Her manager at the agency had simply said, "Big client. Double pay. Don't speak unless spoken to." Double pay meant she could cover her cafe's electricity bill for 2 months. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. Now, standing in the shadow of a marble pillar, she overheard 2 women whispering near the dessert table. "He's already here," one breathed, clutching her clutch like a lifeline. "Where?" "I don't see him." "You never see him until he wants to be seen. That's the point." The second woman shivered, though the ballroom was warm. "My husband says he controls half the shipping routes between Busan and Lagos. The legal half, and She stopped, glanced around, lowered her voice to nothing. Blessing looked away. She did not care about shipping routes. She cared about the tray growing heavy in her arms and the blister forming on her left heel. Then the room changed. It was not a sound. It was a pressure shift, as though the air itself had been pulled taut, and every person in the ballroom felt the string vibrate against their ribs. Conversations died mid-syllable. Laughter evaporated. The string quartet faltered for half a measure before recovering. 200 heads turned toward the grand entrance, with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds changing direction. Han Joon-Okoye walked in. He did not enter a room. He occupied it. The distinction was immediate and absolute. He moved through the doorway with the unhurried stillness of a man who had never once in his life been told to wait. His suit was black, not the fashionable black of Seoul's Gangnam elite, but a deeper, older black, the color of a sky that had forgotten the sun. The cut was immaculate, tailored to a body that carried violence the way other men carried cologne. Invisibly, but you could smell it if you stood close enough. He was tall, broad through the shoulders. His face was a study in controlled geometry, A sharp jawline that could cut glass, high cheekbones inherited from his Korean mother, and skin the deep, rich brown of his Nigerian father's lineage. His eyes were the darkest thing in the room. They swept the ballroom once, slowly, and Blessing felt them pass over her like a searchlight. She froze. His gaze did not linger. It moved on. She exhaled. But her hands were shaking. She told herself it was the weight of the tray. She told herself it was the blister. She told herself it was nothing. On his right wrist, visible where his cuff pulled back as he adjusted his watch, a tattoo coiled around his pulse point. A Korean tiger's head fused with an Ibo uli spiral, inked in black so dark it seemed to absorb the chandelier light. The symbol of dual bloodlines. Dual kingdoms. A man who answered to no flag and no law but his own. The gala's host, a silver-haired minister, rushed forward with outstretched hands. Mr. Han, what an honor. We were beginning to think. I am here, Joon-Okoye said. 3 words. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the faintest trace of an accent that belonged to no single country. The minister's smile faltered. He had prepared a speech. He abandoned it. Of course. Of course. Please allow me to. No. The minister blinked. Joon-Okoye was already walking past him, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carved from stone. He did not shake hands. He did not smile. He moved through the crowd the way a blade moves through water. The crowd parted before he touched it. Blessing watched him from behind her pillar. She told herself she was watching because he was unusual. She told herself it was curiosity. She did not admit, not even to the quietest corner of her mind, that something about the stillness of his face reminded her of the expression her father used to wear before the world fell apart. A stillness that was not peace. A stillness that was war waiting to begin. The incident happened 40 minutes later. Blessing was crossing the ballroom's central aisle with a fresh tray of champagne flutes when a drunk tech executive stumbled backward into her path. His elbow struck her shoulder. The tray tilted. She tried to compensate. Her reflexes were fast. Years of navigating Lagos traffic had given her hands that could catch a falling knife. But the angle was wrong. 3 flutes slid off the silver edge and detonated against the marble floor. The sound was enormous in the sudden quiet. Glass sprayed across the shoes of a woman in a Valentino gown. Champagne splashed the hem of a diplomat's trousers. The string quartet stopped playing. Every eye in the ballroom snapped toward Blessing like a firing squad locking onto a target. Heat flooded her face. She dropped to her knees immediately, gathering shards of glass with bare fingers, her training overriding her humiliation. "I'm so sorry," she murmured in English, then switched to halting Korean. The tech executive laughed. "Careful, girl. That glass costs more than your salary." She did not look up. She kept picking up shards. A thin line of blood appeared on her index finger, where the glass spit into her skin. She ignored it. Then, the crowd parted again. Black shoes entered her field of vision. Hand-stitched Italian leather, polished to a mirror finish. The hem of black trousers, razor-creased. She followed the line upward, and her breath stopped. Han Joon-Okoye stood above her. Up close, he was devastating in a way that had nothing to do with beauty. His face was too sharp, too still, too controlled. His dark eyes looked down at her with an expression she could not read. Not anger, not pity, not amusement. Something colder. Something that felt like being examined under a microscope by a man who had already decided your molecular structure was uninteresting. The tattoo on his neck was visible now, rising above his collar, the same tiger annuli design, larger here, the ink disappearing beneath his shirt like a secret he wore against his skin. "Leave it," he said. His voice was quiet. The entire ballroom heard it anyway. Blessing's hands stilled over the broken glass. She looked up. His eyes met hers, and the air between them compressed into something dense and suffocating, as though the 76 floors beneath them had suddenly vanished, and they were falling. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes, something buried so deep it might have been geological, shifted. A fracture. A hairline crack in 7 years of permafrost. He had made a vow. 7 years ago, In a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and betrayal, with blood still drying on his knuckles and the woman he had loved signing documents that would have destroyed his family's empire, he had spoken 3 sentences to the empty air. I will never again give a woman the power to break me. I will never again mistake obsession for love. If I feel it again, I will cut it out before it takes root. He had kept that vow with the same ruthless precision he applied to everything else. He had dismantled every attachment. He had exiled every emotion. He had built an empire on the foundation of his own emptiness. And now this woman, this catering girl kneeling in broken glass with blood on her fingers and defiance in her soft, expressive eyes, had looked at him as though she saw the fracture beneath the armor. No one saw the fracture. No one was allowed to. I said leave it, he repeated, his voice dropping lower. Blessing's jaw tightened. She was not accustomed to being spoken to as though she were furniture. The old Blessing, the Lego socialite, the senator's daughter, would have stood and matched his coldness with her own. But that woman was dead. The woman kneeling on the marble was a survivor, and survivors knew when to fold. She placed the glass shards on the tray and stood. She was shorter than him by nearly a foot. She had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze.
She did it anyway.
The glass is dangerous barefoot, she said quietly in English. Her voice was steady. Someone will cut themselves. I'd rather clean it than watch someone bleed. Silence. The ballroom held its collective breath. No one spoke to Han Joon-Okoye like that. No one corrected him. No one offered him a reason. You obeyed or you disappeared. His eyes narrowed. The tattoo on his collarbone pulsed with a subtle movement of his throat as he swallowed, the only sign that her words had landed anywhere inside him. Your name, he said. Not a question.
A demand.
Blessing. Blessing, he repeated, as though testing the weight of it on his tongue. His expression remained carved from ice. You will report to the private suite on the 78th floor.
Now.
He turned and walked away. The crowd closed behind him like water filling a void. Blessing stood alone in the center of the ballroom, her bleeding finger pressed against her palm, her heart hammering against her ribs. The drunk executive was still laughing. The string quartet resumed playing. The gala continued as though nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The 78th floor was silent in a way that felt expensive. The hallway was lined with dark wood and recessed lighting that cast no shadows. 2 security guards stood outside a suite door, their earpieces coiling into their collars. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence was the language. Blessing approached with her hands clasped in front of her, her catering vest suddenly feeling like a costume she had outgrown. One guard opened the door without asking her name. They already knew. Of course they knew. The suite was larger than her entire cafe. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Seoul skyline, rain streaking the glass like tears on a face. The furniture was minimal: black leather, smoked glass, a single orchid on a table that probably cost more than her rent. The air smelled of sandalwood and something metallic, something that reminded her of the inside of a bank vault. Han Joon-Okoye stood at the window, his back to her. His suit jacket was draped over a chair. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing the full length of the tattoo on his right forearm, the tiger's body now, winding through uli patterns and Korean hanja characters she could not read. The ink was old, the lines precise, the meaning clearly sacred. He did not turn around.
Close the door, he said. She did.
The lock clicked with a sound that felt final. You are not Korean, he said, still facing the window, still not looking at her.
No.
Nigerian. Yes. How long have you been in Seoul? 3 years. Why? The question was casual, but the weight behind it was not. Blessing felt the air tighten. She recognized interrogation when she heard it. Her father had conducted enough of them in his Lagos office to teach her the cadence. Work, she said simply.
He turned.
His eyes locked onto hers, and the temperature in the room dropped. He studied her face with the methodical precision of a man reading a contract for hidden clauses. His gaze moved from her eyes to her mouth to the pulse point at her throat, and she felt each look like a physical touch. You do not belong in catering, he said. The statement hung in the air. Blessing's spine stiffened. Excuse me? Your posture. Your hands. The way you stood when I dismissed you. He tilted his head slightly, the tattoo on his neck catching the light. You are accustomed to rooms like this one. You are accustomed to being the most important person in them. And yet you are wearing a uniform that costs less than the napkin you used to clean my floor. Blessing's breath caught. She had not expected to be seen. She had spent 3 years perfecting her invisibility, and this man had dismantled it in 40 seconds without raising his voice. I don't know what you think you see, she said, her voice carefully neutral. But I'm here to serve champagne, not to be psychoanalyzed by a billionaire. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something darker. Something that recognized her defiance the way a wolf recognizes another predator entering its territory. You are not afraid of me, he observed. Should I be? Everyone is. I'm not everyone. Silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Rain lashed the windows. The city glittered below, indifferent to the collision happening 78 floors above its streets. Joon-Okoye stepped closer. 1 step.
2.
He moved with that terrifying stillness, his body utterly controlled, his presence filling the room the way smoke fills a sealed chamber. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the individual threads of his shirt, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and rain, and something darker underneath. Everyone who is not afraid of me, he said softly, ends up destroyed by me. Consider that a warning blessing. He said her name the way a man says the name of a disease he has just been diagnosed with reluctant fascination and the knowledge that it will change everything. I'll take my chances, she whispered. His jaw tightened. The tattoo on his wrist flexed as his hand curled into a fist at his side. For a moment, a fraction of a second, so brief, she might have imagined it, his mask slipped. Something raw and wounded flashed behind his eyes, something that looked like recognition, like memory, like the ghost of a man he used to be before the vow turned him to stone. Then the mask returned. Get out, he said. Blessing turned and walked to the door. Her legs were steady. Her hands were not. She opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and did not look back. Behind her, Han Joon-Okoye stood alone in the silent suite, his reflection fractured by rain on the glass, and pressed his tattooed fist against the window hard enough to leave a mark. He had sworn he would never feel this again. He had sworn on blood, and yet his hand was shaking. 3 days later, Seoul's autumn wind stripped the ginkgo trees bare and scattered gold leaves across the streets of Itaewon. Blessing unlocked the front door of her cafe at 6 in the morning, her breath fogging in the cold air. The space was small, 8 tables, a counter display of pastries she baked before dawn, an espresso machine that groaned like an old man climbing stairs. The walls were painted warm terracotta, a stubborn piece of Legos she had carried across the ocean. She tied her apron and began arranging the display case. Chin chin. Puff puff. Meat pies with golden crusts. She had learned to bake in her mother's kitchen in Victoria Island, standing on a stool at age 7, her small hands dusted with flour. The bakery was the only thing she had left that felt like home. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from her catering agency. New contract. Han Joon-Okoye Group corporate event. 200 guests. Payment. 8x standard rate. Mandatory acceptance. Report to Han Joon-Okoye Tower, Gangnam, Friday 6 p.m. Blessing stared at the screen. 8 times the standard rate would cover 6 months of rent. It would fix the espresso machine. It would let her breathe for the first time in a year. It would also put her back in his orbit. She thought of his eyes. The stillness. The warning. Everyone who is not afraid of me ends up destroyed by me. She typed. Accepted. She told herself it was about the money. She told herself she was strong enough to resist whatever gravitational pull that man exerted. She told herself he had probably already forgotten her face. She was wrong about all 3. Han Joon-Okoye Tower rose 60 stories into the Gangnam skyline, like a blade of black glass. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silence, staffed by employees who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their employer could end their careers with a glance. Blessing entered through the service entrance, carrying 2 boxes of pastries, her catering uniform freshly pressed. The elevator deposited her on the 42nd floor, the executive dining level. The kitchen was industrial, gleaming, and empty except for a team of Han Joon-Okoye Group's private chefs who regarded her with undisguised suspicion. "You're the external caterer?" the head chef asked, eyeing her boxes. "Yes. Mr. Han specifically requested your agency." The chef's tone suggested this was either a test or a punishment. "He does not make requests. Consider yourself noted." Blessing unpacked her pastries in silence. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. Through the kitchen's glass partition, she could see the executive boardroom. A long obsidian table, 12 chairs, 11 occupied by men and women in suits that cost more than her car. At the head of the table sat Han Joon-Okoye. He was mid-sentence, though mid-sentence implied a volume he did not employ. He spoke in a low, measured cadence that forced everyone in the room to lean forward, to strain, to submit to the effort of hearing him. His tie was black. His shirt was white, the top button undone, revealing the upper edge of the tattoo on his chest, the tiger's eye, watching the room from beneath his collarbone. A woman at the far end of the table was presenting a quarterly report. Her voice trembled. Joon-Okoye listened with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. When she finished, the silence lasted 4 seconds.
5.
6. "Incorrect," he said. The woman paled. "Sir, the figures." "I said incorrect." He did not raise his voice.
He did not need to.
The word landed like a guillotine. "Your projections assume a stable market in West Africa." "The market in West Africa has not been stable since I restructured the Lagos corridor last month." "Revise." "By morning." The woman nodded, so fast Blessing thought her neck might snap. The meeting continued. Joon-Okoye's eyes swept the room and stopped. Through the glass partition, across the kitchen, past the stainless steel counters and the steam rising from the ovens, his gaze locked onto Blessing. She froze, a meat pie halfway to the display tray. His expression did not change. Not visibly, but his hand, resting on the obsidian table, curled inward, the tattoo on his knuckles, 4 small uli spirals, one on each finger, flexing with attention. The meeting continued around him. He did not hear a word of it. He was looking at her as though she were the only real thing in a room full of projections. Blessing looked away first. She placed the meat pie on the tray with exaggerated care and turned her back to the glass. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She told herself it meant nothing. The tattoo on his knuckles told a different story. The event ended at 10 p.m. Blessing was packing her remaining pastries into boxes when the kitchen door opened and the air changed. She did not need to turn around. The silence that entered the room with him was a physical presence, heavier than sound. "Leave us," Joon-Okoye said to the chefs. They vanished.
The door closed.
The lock engaged. Blessing kept her back to him. She folded a sheet of wax paper with meticulous attention. Her fingers were numb. "You accepted the contract," he said from behind her. His voice was closer than she expected. He had crossed the kitchen in silence, the way predators cross open ground. "It paid well. It paid 8 times the market rate. You knew who it was for." "I knew my rent was due. You knew I would be here." She turned. He was standing 2 feet away, his jacket gone, his sleeves rolled up, the full tapestry of his tattoos exposed. The tiger on his forearm, the uli spirals on his wrist, the Hanja characters on his inner elbow that she now realized read never again. The ink was a map of his damage, and he wore it openly, the way a king wears a crown forged from the swords of his enemies. "If you didn't want me here," she said, meeting his eyes, "you wouldn't have requested my agency." His jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek flickered, the only crack in his composure. "Do not flatter yourself," he said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her sternum. "You were a variable I needed to assess. Nothing more." "Assess for what?" "For the reason you are not afraid of me." He stepped closer. The air between them compressed. "Fear is information. The absence of fear is a threat. I do not tolerate threats. I'm a baker, Mr. Han. I make puff-puff and meat pies. I am not a threat to your empire." "No," he agreed softly. You are something worse. What? He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. The sandalwood scent enveloped her. The tattoo on his neck pulsed with his heartbeat. You are a reminder, he whispered, of a version of myself I killed 7 years ago. And I do not know whether to destroy you or keep you. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Blessing's breath hitched. She should have stepped back. She should have lowered her eyes. She should have played the role he expected, the frightened employee, the invisible woman, the nobody. Instead, she lifted her chin and said, I am not her. The effect was instantaneous. Joon-Okoye recoiled as though she had struck him. His eyes widened, a fraction, a flicker, but on a face that controlled every micro-expression, it was the equivalent of a scream. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, his fingers wrapping around her pulse point with a pressure that was not quite painful, but was absolutely possessive. What did you say? His voice was barely audible. The calm was gone. Something volcanic churned beneath the surface. I said I am not her, Blessing repeated, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered against his fingers. Whoever hurt you, whoever made you build these walls, I am not her, and I will not be punished for her crimes. He stared at her. His grip tightened. The tattoo on his wrist pressed against her skin, the ink warm from his body heat. For a moment, she thought he might crush her wrist. For a moment, she thought he might pull her against his chest. His eyes were a war zone, fury and longing and grief, and something so raw it made her chest ache to witness it. Then he released her. He stepped back. His mask slammed down like a vault door. His expression returned to its default setting of absolute, terrifying neutrality. Leave, he said. Do not accept another contract from this company. Do not enter this building again. If I see you in my orbit, I will remove you from it. Permanently. Blessing picked up her boxes. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle. You can fire me from your building, she said quietly, without turning around. But you cannot fire me from your head. We both know that. She left. Behind her, Han Joon-Okoye stood in the empty kitchen, his tattooed hands gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter until the metal bent beneath his fingers. The vow roared in his skull like a siren. Never again. Never again. Never again. But her voice echoed louder. I am not her. 2 weeks passed. The Seoul autumn deepened into winter's first breath. Frost crept across Blessing's cafe windows each morning, and she spent her evenings wrapped in a knitted blanket, reviewing accounts that refused to balance. The Han Joon-Okoye payment had saved her, but survival was a treadmill, not a destination. She did not see him. She did not hear from him. She told herself this was a victory. Then the men came to her cafe. It was a Thursday night past midnight. Blessing was alone, scrubbing the espresso machine, when the front door's bell chimed. She looked up, expecting a late customer. Instead, 3 men walked in. They wore dark coats and darker expressions. Their eyes scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of people who were not looking for coffee. The largest of them, a Korean man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, approached the counter. He placed a photograph on the glass surface. It was a surveillance image of Blessing entering Han Joon-Okoye Tower 2 weeks ago. You've been spending time in places that don't belong to you, the man said in accented English. His smile did not reach his eyes. Our employer would like to understand why. Blessing's blood turned to ice. She recognized the type. Her father's world in Lagos had been full of men like this, enforcers, message carriers, the blunt instruments of powerful men's paranoia. She had thought she had escaped that world when she crossed the ocean. I catered an event, she said, keeping her voice level. That's all. Our employer disagrees. The man leaned forward. The smell of cigarettes and violence radiated from his coat. He believes you are a plant.
A spy.
Sent by the silent sovereign to infiltrate his operations. Blessing's mind raced. The silent sovereign, Joon-Okoye's underground alias. These men belonged to a rival syndicate. They had seen her at his tower and drawn the wrong conclusion. I don't know anything about your employer or his operations, she said. I bake bread. That is the entirety of my criminal enterprise. The man's smile vanished. He reached across the counter and grabbed her apron, yanking her forward. The espresso machine clattered. A ceramic mug shattered on the floor. "We will ask once more," he hissed. "And then we will stop asking." The other two men moved toward the door, locking it from the inside. The deadbolt clicked with a sound that echoed in Blessing's bones. She did not scream. She had learned, in the worst years of her life, that screaming attracted the wrong kind of attention. Instead, she reached beneath the counter for the heavy iron rolling pin she kept next to the flour bin. When the scarred man lunged, she swung. The iron connected with his temple with a sickening crack. He staggered. Blood sprayed across the pastry display. Blessing did not hesitate. She ducked under his grasping arm, vaulted over the counter, and ran for the back exit. The second man intercepted her in the hallway. His fist caught her ribs. She heard something crack, a bone, a cartilage, she could not tell, and the pain exploded through her torso like white fire. She gasped, stumbled, and drove her knee into his groin with every ounce of Lagos Street survival her body remembered. He doubled over. She elbowed the back of his skull and kept running. The back door. The alley. Rain and darkness, and the distant wail of a Seoul police siren that might or might not arrive in time. She burst through the door into the alley and collided with a wall of black wool. Strong hands caught her shoulders. She screamed, a real scream this time, raw and animal, and fought against the grip with everything she had left. "Blessing. Stop." The voice cut through her panic like a blade through silk. Low. Controlled. Familiar. She looked up. Han Joon-Okoye stood in the alley, rain streaming down his face, his black overcoat open over a white shirt soaked through to the skin. The tattoo on his chest was fully visible through the wet fabric, the tiger's eye, wide and blazing, staring at her from over his heart. His eyes were not cold. They were not controlled. They were incandescent with a fury so absolute it made the air around him vibrate. Behind him, 4 of his security operatives materialized from the darkness, their movements silent and lethal. "Who touched you?" he asked. His voice was quiet. The quietness was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. 3 men, she gasped, clutching her ribs. "Inside. They said they work for your rival. They thought I was a spy." Something shifted in his face. The fury did not diminish. It focused, narrowing to a point so sharp it could have drawn blood from the air itself. He released her shoulders and turned to his men. 2 words. "Kill them." The operatives moved into the cafe like shadows. The sounds that followed were brief and wet and final. Blessing pressed her hands over her ears and sank against the alley wall, her legs giving out beneath her. Joon-Okoye knelt in front of her. In the rain. In the filth of a Seoul alley. The man who did not bend for ministers or billionaires knelt on wet concrete and gathered her against his chest with a tenderness that contradicted everything she knew about him. His coat enveloped her. His hand cradled the back of her head, his fingers threading through her rain-soaked hair. The tattoo on his wrist pressed against her cheek. The tiger, the Uli spiral, the ink that marked him as a man who owned cities and crushed empires. "You are not allowed to die," he said against her hair. His voice was rough, fractured. The voice of a man speaking through the wreckage of his own control. "Do you understand me? I have not given you permission to die." Blessing closed her eyes. Her ribs screamed. Her hands were shaking. The rain was cold, and his body was warm, and the vow he had sworn 7 years ago was crumbling around them both, like the walls of a burning house. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care?" His arms tightened around her. His jaw pressed against the top of her head. She felt his heartbeat through his chest, fast, irregular, human. The silent sovereign, the man who spoke in commands and silences, was trembling. "Because," he said, and the word broke in the middle, "if you die, I will have to admit that you mattered. And I cannot survive that admission." The rain fell harder. The sirens grew louder. Somewhere inside the cafe, the last of the rival syndicate men stopped breathing. Blessing buried her face in his chest, and let herself be held by the most dangerous man in 2 continents. And Han Joon-Okoye, the man who had sworn on blood and bone that he would never love again, closed his eyes and whispered a word he had not spoken in 7 years. A word that terrified him more than any enemy, any betrayal, any war. Stay. The car ride to his private hospital was silent. Blessing sat in the back of the armored Maybach, wrapped in his coat, her ribs wrapped in a compression bandage by a medic who had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Joon-Okoye sat beside her, his posture rigid, his hands folded in his lap, the tattoos on his knuckles white-knuckled against the darkness. He did not touch her again. The vulnerability of the alley had been sealed behind his armor the moment the car door closed. But she could feel him, his awareness of her, his hypervigilance, the way his eyes tracked every flinch she made when the car hit a bump. "You knew they were coming," she said quietly. "It was not a question. My surveillance flagged the rival syndicate's movements 3 hours ago. They had been tracking your cafe for 2 days. 2 days. And you waited until tonight to intervene?"
His jaw tightened.
"I was determining whether you were genuinely a target or whether you had orchestrated the encounter yourself." The words landed like a slap. Blessing stared at him. "You thought I staged my own assault. I consider all possibilities. Even the ones where I'm a human being who almost died?" He turned to look at her. The car's interior lights caught the angles of his face, the sharp jawline, the cold eyes, the tattoo on his neck that seemed to pulse with his restraint. "Especially those," he said. The silence that followed was suffocating. Blessing looked out the window at the rain-blurred streets of Seoul and felt something inside her chest harden. She had mistaken his rescue for tenderness. She had mistaken his stay for vulnerability. But this man did not do vulnerability. He did strategy. He did control. He had saved her life the way a chess player saves a piece, because it was useful, not because it was precious. Or so she told herself. The Maybach pulled into the underground garage of a private medical facility in Hanamdong. Joon-Okoye opened her door before the driver could. He offered his hand. She ignored it and stepped out on her own, wincing as her ribs protested. He did not react to the rejection. But the tattoo on his wrist flexed, and she caught the faintest flicker of something wounded in his eyes before the mask returned. A doctor was waiting. X-rays were taken. 2 cracked ribs. No internal bleeding. She was lucky. The doctor said this with the casual detachment of a man who delivered good news to billionaires for a living. Joon-Okoye stood in the corner of the examination room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He watched the doctor wrap her ribs. He watched Blessing wince. He watched the way she bit her lip to keep from crying out. His hands remained still. His face remained stone. But when the doctor left the room, and Blessing was alone with him under the fluorescent lights, he spoke. "You'll stay at my residence until the threat is neutralized."
No.
It was not a request. It was not a conversation either. "I'm going home." "Your home has a broken lock and a crime scene in the kitchen. You are not going home." "I am not your prisoner, Mr. Han." "No," he agreed, stepping closer. The air between them tightened. "You are my responsibility. And I do not abandon what is mine." The word mine hung in the air, heavy and dangerous and intoxicating. Blessing's breath caught. She opened her mouth to argue, to push back, to remind him that she was not a possession to be claimed. But the exhaustion won, the pain won, the memory of his arms around her in the rain won. "Fine," she whispered. "But I am not her. Whatever ghost you see when you look at me, I am not her." His eyes darkened. The tattoo on his collarbone shifted as he swallowed. "I know," he said. And for the first time, his voice carried something that sounded almost like grief. That is the problem. His residence was a fortress disguised as a penthouse. The entire top floor of a Hanamdong high-rise, accessible only by a private elevator that required biometric authentication. The interior was stark, black marble, white walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. No photographs. No personal objects. No evidence that a human being lived here. It looked like a museum dedicated to the concept of emptiness. Blessing sat on the edge of a guest room bed, her ribs aching, her mind spinning. Joon-Okoye had disappeared into his study the moment they arrived, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice too low to hear through the closed door. She stared at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her was tired,
Bruised.
older than her 28 years. The Lagos socialite was gone. The cafe owner was barely holding on. And now she was sitting in the home of a man who terrified half of Asia and who had just told her she was his. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You should not have come back to Seoul, Blessing. Your father's debts did not die with him. And the silent sovereign is not the man you think he is. Her blood froze. Her father. The name she had buried. The legacy she had fled. The secret she had carried across an ocean and 3 years of silence. Before she could process the message, the study door opened. Joon-Okoye walked into the hallway, his phone still in his hand, his expression darker than she had ever seen it. The tattoo on his chest was visible through his open shirt, the tiger's eye, blazing, predatory, alive. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? He demanded. She held up the phone. He crossed the room in 3 strides, took the device from her hand, and read the message. His face went through a transformation she would never forget. Confusion, recognition, shock, and then a rage so profound it seemed to warp the air around him. He looked at her. His eyes were no longer dark. They were black, bottomless. The eyes of a man who had just discovered that the one crack in his armor was also the one wound he could not survive. Your father, he said, his voice barely human. Your father's name. Blessing's throat closed. She knew what was coming. She had always known, on some level, that this moment was inevitable, that the universe was too cruel, too precise, to let her escape the gravity of her own bloodline. John, she whispered. My father's name was Emeka John. The phone shattered in his hand. Glass and metal rained onto the marble floor. Joon-Okoye's breathing stopped. His entire body went rigid, the tattoos on his arms standing out against his skin like brands. Emeka John, the Lagos kingpin, the man who had orchestrated the betrayal that destroyed Joon-Okoye's marriage 7 years ago. The man who had used Joon-Okoye's wife as a pawn, feeding her lies and documents and poison until she turned against her own husband. The man whose actions had driven Joon-Okoye to that hospital room, to that blood-soaked vow, to 7 years of emotional annihilation. And Blessing, the woman he had pulled from the rain, the woman whose defiance had cracked his armor, the woman whose name he had whispered in the dark like a prayer he did not believe in, was his daughter. The daughter of his destroyer. The blood of his betrayer. Joon-Okoye stared at her. The silence was absolute. The Han River glittered below, indifferent. The city pulsed with 10 million lives that would never know the devastation happening in this room. You, he said, his voice cracking like ice over a frozen lake. You are his blood. Blessing stood. Her ribs screamed. Her eyes burned. But she did not look away. I am my own person, she said. I am not my father's sins. Aren't you? The rage was rising now, volcanic, unstoppable. The tattoo on his neck pulsed with the fury in his veins. He destroyed my life. He weaponized the woman I loved. He turned my marriage into a battlefield and left me standing in the wreckage. And now his daughter is standing in my home, wearing my coat, breathing my air, and asking me to believe she is different. I didn't ask for any of this. Blessing shouted, the pain in her ribs exploding into white fire. I didn't choose my father.
I didn't choose your past.
I didn't choose to walk into your gala, or your tower, or your life. But I am here. And I am not her. And I am not him. Tears streamed down her face. She did not wipe them away. She let him see them. Let him see the full, unguarded truth of her pain, her fear, her desperate, stubborn refusal to be defined by a dead man's crimes. Joon-Okoye stood motionless. The war inside him was visible on his face, the vow screaming at him to destroy her, to exile her, to cut her out before she could finish what her father had started. And beneath the vow, something else, something quieter, something that sounded like her name. He turned away. He walked to the window. He pressed his forehead against the glass, his tattooed hands gripping the frame until his knuckles turned white. Get out, he said. His voice was hollow.
Dead.
The voice of a man burying himself alive. Leave this house. Leave Seoul. Leave my life. If I see you again, I will not be able to stop myself from destroying you. And his voice broke. I do not want to destroy you. Blessing stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, her heart shattering in real time. June, she whispered. The first time she had used his name. It hung in the air like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. He flinched, his entire body convulsed with the effort of not turning around.
Go, he said.
She went. The elevator descended 60 floors in silence. The lobby was empty. The Seoul night was cold and rain-slicked and endless. Blessing stepped onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back and the ghost of his sandalwood scent on her skin. Behind her, on the top floor of the tower, Han Joon-Okoye stood at the window and watched her disappear into the rain. His reflection stared back at him, the sharp jaw, the cold eyes, the tattoos that marked him as a man who had conquered everything except his own heart. The vow echoed in the empty penthouse. Never again. But as he watched the street where she had stood, his hand pressed against the glass where her reflection had been, he realized the most terrifying truth of his life. He had already broken it. And the woman who had broken it was the daughter of the man who had made him swear it in the first place. The rain fell harder. The city swallowed her whole. And Han Joon-Okoye, the silent sovereign, the man who feared nothing and controlled everything, sank to his knees on the marble floor and did something he had not done in 7 years.
He wept.
The rain had not stopped. It fell on Seoul the way grief falls on the body of a woman who has just been told to disappear, relentless, cold, and utterly indifferent to her survival. Blessing walked through the streets of Hanamdong with her arms wrapped around her cracked ribs, her breath coming in shallow gasps that tasted of copper and rainwater. She had no coat. She had no phone. She had no plan. The city moved around her like a river around a stone. Taxis hissed through puddles. Neon signs bled color onto wet asphalt. A couple huddled under a shared umbrella, laughing at something she could not hear. Normal life. Ordinary life. The kind of life she had built for herself over 3 painstaking years, and that had just been dismantled in a single evening by a man whose tears she could still feel on her skin. She walked for 40 minutes before her legs gave out. She sank onto a bus stop bench near the Han River, her back against the cold metal, her eyes fixed on the water. The river was black and swollen with rain, its surface fractured by the reflections of 1,000 city lights. It looked the way she felt, beautiful and broken and moving in a direction it could not control. Her ribs throbbed with every heartbeat. The bandage beneath her shirt was soaked through. She needed a hospital. She needed sleep. She needed to not think about the way Han Joon-Okoye had said her name in the alley, like a man speaking the last word of a dying language. She closed her eyes. The rain hammered her face. When she opened them, a black sedan was parked at the curb. The window rolled down. Inside, a woman she did not recognize held out a phone. "Get in," the woman said in Korean-accented English. "Before they find you." Blessing did not move. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows what your father owed. And someone who knows the men looking for you tonight are not the same men who attacked your cafe." The woman's eyes were sharp, calculating, and not unkind. "You have approximately 6 minutes before Chairman Beck's second team arrives. I suggest you use them wisely." Chairman Beck. The name landed like a stone in Blessing's stomach. She had heard it before, whispered in her father's Lego study, spoken in tones of fear and respect by men who feared and respected very little. Beck Min-suk, the Korean industrialist who controlled the shadow economy between Seoul and West Africa. The man her father had called the Spider. She got in the car. The sedan pulled away from the curb with the quiet urgency of a vehicle that understood the value of invisibility. The woman handed Blessing a dry towel and a burner phone. "Your cafe is gone," the woman said, her eyes on the road. "Beck's men torched it 20 minutes ago. The fire department is still responding." Blessing's hands went numb. The towel slipped from her fingers. Her cafe, her mother's recipes, the terracotta walls, the espresso machine that groaned like an old man, the only piece of home she had left in the world, was ash. Why? She whispered. Because you are Emeka John's daughter. And because Han Joon-Okoye held you in his arms in a public alley where 6 surveillance cameras captured every second. The woman glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. In Beck's world, that makes you a weapon. And weapons get destroyed before they can be used. Blessing pressed her forehead against the cold window and let the tears come. Not for herself. For the cafe. For the puff-puff and the meat pies, and the early mornings dusted with flour. For the small, stubborn life she had built from nothing and that the world had just taken from her for the second time. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere Beck cannot reach. Somewhere even the silent sovereign does not know about." The woman paused. Yet, 3 days later, the safe house in Buckshin Hanok village smelled of pine wood and old paper. It was a traditional Korean house tucked into a narrow alley of curved tile roofs and stone walls, hidden from the modern city by centuries of architectural stubbornness. The woman, who had introduced herself only as Soo-jin, had left Blessing with supplies, a locked door, and a warning. "Do not leave this house. Do not use your real name. Do not contact anyone from your old life." Blessing had nodded. She had not argued. Her ribs were healing slowly, her bruises shifting from purple to yellow to the sickly green of fading violence. She spent the days sitting on the ondal floor, wrapped in a Hanok quilt, staring at the small garden through the paper screen doors. She also spent the days thinking about him. Han Joon-Okoye. The way his voice had broken when he said stay. The way his hands had trembled when he told her to leave. The way the tattoo over his heart, the tiger's eye, had blazed through his wet shirt like a brand marking him as something both monstrous and sacred. She could not reconcile the two versions of him. The man who ordered kills in a quiet voice and the man who knelt in the rain and wept. The sovereign who controlled shipping routes and syndicates, and the human being who had looked at her with eyes full of 7 years of unprocessed grief. On the 3rd night, she found the box. It was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the Hanok's smallest room, a wooden crate, old and water-stained, sealed with a lock that had rusted open years ago. Inside were documents, photographs, letters written in her father's handwriting, the same looping script she remembered from birthday cards he had sent before the world collapsed. Blessing spread the papers across the floor and read. The story they told was not the one she had carried in her chest for 3 years. The story she knew, the one the Lagos newspapers had printed, the one that had driven her into exile, was that Emeka John was a ruthless kingpin who had betrayed his allies, destroyed the Han Okoye marriage for profit, and died in a shootout with Nigerian police before he could face justice. The documents told a different story. Emeka John had been used. The letters, addressed to a man identified only as B, revealed that Beck Min-suk had orchestrated the entire betrayal. Beck had fed Emeka false intelligence. Beck had manipulated Joon-Okoye's wife, feeding her fabricated evidence that her husband was planning to abandon her. Beck had turned the Han Okoye marriage into a weapon and aimed it at the Han Okoye empire, using Emeka as the trigger. Emeka had realized the truth too late. The final letter in the box was dated 2 weeks before his death. It was addressed to Blessing. "My dearest Blessing, by the time you read this, I will likely be dead. Beck has cornered me, and I have no allies left. I write this not to ask for your forgiveness. I do not deserve it, but to tell you the truth. The man I destroyed, Han Joon-Okoye, did not deserve what happened to him. I was the instrument, not the architect. Beck Min-suk is the spider, and we were all caught in his web. If you ever meet Joon-Okoye, tell him I am sorry. Tell him his wife was innocent too. Tell him Beck played us all. Forgive me, my daughter. I was weak. And weakness, in our world, is a death sentence for everyone you love. Your father, Emeka." Blessing sat on the floor of the Hanok, her father's letter pressed against her chest, and sobbed until her cracked ribs screamed and her vision blurred and the paper screens rattled with the force of her grief. Her father was not the monster she had believed him to be. He was a victim, a pawn, a man who had been destroyed by the same spider who was now hunting her. And Joon-Okoye, the man who had exiled her from his life because of her blood, had been destroyed by the same web. They were not enemies. They were survivors of the same war. She reached for the burner phone Sujin had given her. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the only number she had memorized before her real phone shattered on the marble floor of his penthouse. His private line. It rang once.
Twice.
3 times. Then his voice, low and guarded, and carrying the weight of 3 sleepless nights. "Who is this?" "It's me," Blessing said. Her voice cracked. "June, it's me. And I know the truth." Silence. The kind of silence that has texture, that has weight, that presses against your eardrums like deep water. "How did you get this number?" His voice was ice. But beneath the ice, she heard it, the fracture. The same crack she had heard in the alley. The same vulnerability he would rather die than expose. "Your wife was innocent," she said. "My father was innocent. Baek Min-suk orchestrated everything. I have the proof."
The silence changed.
It went from defensive to dangerous, the way a predator's stillness changes when it catches a scent on the wind. "Where are you?" he asked. "I can't tell you that. Not yet. Not until you."
Where are
you? Each word was a separate detonation. Controlled.
Precise.
Terrifying. Blessing closed her eyes. Bukshin. The hammock on the 3rd alley past the tea house. "But June, you need to listen to me.
Baek knows about me.
He knows about us. He burned my cafe. He's coming for." The line went dead. She stared at the phone. The screen reflected her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the bruise still fading on her jaw, the soft, expressive features that her mother used to say were her greatest weapon and her greatest vulnerability. She had made a terrible mistake.
Or the only choice she had left.
She did not know which. He arrived in 11 minutes. Blessing knew this because she counted every second, her back pressed against the hammock's wooden wall, her father's documents clutched to her chest like a shield. The sound of the Maybach's engine was unmistakable, a low, predatory hum that cut through the quiet Bukshin streets like a blade through silk. The door opened before she could stand. Han Joon-Okoye filled the doorway. He was dressed in black, as always, but the precision was gone. His tie was loosened. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the full expanse of the tattoo on his chest, the tiger, the uli spirals, the Hanja characters that read never again. His hair was disheveled, as though he had driven through the Seoul night with the windows down and the wind tearing at his composure. His eyes found her. The air between them detonated. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand gripping the doorframe so hard the ancient would groaned. The tattoo on his knuckles, the 4 uli spirals, stood out white against his brown skin. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle trembling beneath the sharp angle of his cheekbone.
"Show me," he said.
No greeting. No acknowledgement of the 3 days of silence, the exile, the tears. Just the command, raw and urgent, of a man who had been drowning in a question for 7 years and had just been thrown a rope. Blessing spread the documents on the floor between them. The letters. The photographs. The financial records that traced Baek Min-suk's money through the same channels that had destroyed the Han Joon-Okoye marriage. She watched his face as he read. It was like watching a glacier calve. His expression did not change in the way normal faces change. No widening eyes, no gasping breath, no dramatic recoil. Instead, the change was tectonic. Slow. Massive. Irreversible. The cold control that had defined his face for 7 years began to fracture along fault lines she could see forming in real time. His left hand pressed flat against the floor, the wrist tattoo flexing with attention. His breathing slowed to a rhythm that was not calm, but was the opposite of calm, the breathing of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. When he reached Emika's final letter, the one addressed to Blessing, his hand stopped moving. He read it once.
Twice.
3 times. Then he looked up at her. His eyes were wet. The silent sovereign, the man who had ordered kills in a whisper, the man who had built an empire on the foundation of his own emotional annihilation, was kneeling on the floor of a Bukshin hammock with tears in his eyes and the ghost of his dead marriage spread out around him like shrapnel. "I killed men for this," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I dismantled entire networks. I burned bridges that took decades to build. I destroyed your father's operation because I believed he was the architect. He swallowed. The tattoo on his neck pulsed. And he was a pawn. He was, Blessing whispered. My wife. His voice broke on the word. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the grief was so raw it filled the room like smoke. She didn't betray me. She was used. Beck fed her lies. He made her believe I was going to abandon her, that I was planning to dissolve the marriage and take the empire for myself. She signed those documents out of fear, not malice. And his fist struck the floor. The wood cracked. I never asked her. I never gave her the chance to explain. I just destroyed everything. Blessing moved toward him. Her ribs protested. She ignored them. She knelt in front of him on the scattered documents, close enough to see the individual threads of his shirt, close enough to smell sandalwood and rain and the metallic tang of his fury. You were grieving, she said softly. You were betrayed by everyone you trusted. You did what you had to do to survive. I survived, he said, his voice hollow. But I did not live. Not for 7 years. I built a tomb and called it an empire. He looked at her. The piercing dark eyes, usually so controlled, so unreadable, were wide open. Unguarded. Terrified. And then you walked into my gala, he said. In a catering uniform, with blood on your fingers and defiance in your eyes. And you looked at me the way she used to look at me before the lies. Before the betrayal. Before the vow. Blessing's breath caught. June. I told myself you were a threat, he continued, his voice gaining intensity, the words spilling out as though a dam had broken inside him. I told myself you were a variable to be assessed, a problem to be eliminated. I told myself the vow was stronger than whatever this is. He gestured between them, his tattooed hand trembling. But the vow is a lie. It was always a lie. I made it in a hospital room while bleeding from wounds that were not my fault, and I have been punishing myself for 7 years for a betrayal I did not cause. He reached out and touched her face. His fingers were gentle, shockingly gentle for hands that had bent metal and shattered phones and ordered deaths. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth. The tattoo on his wrist pressed against her skin, warm and alive. You are not her, he said. You are not your father. You are not the past. You are the first real thing that has happened to me in 7 years, and I sent you into the rain because I was too afraid to admit that I needed you. Blessing's eyes filled with tears. She leaned into his touch. Her hand covered his, her fingers threading through his, the woolly spirals on his knuckles pressing against her palm. I need you too, she whispered. I've been alone for so long. And I am so tired of being alone.
He pulled her against his chest.
His arms wrapped around her with a ferocity that was not possession but desperation, the grip of a man holding onto the last solid thing in a world that had dissolved beneath his feet. She buried her face in his neck, breathing in sandalwood and skin and the faint, sacred ink of the tiger that watched over his heart. I will not let them take you, he said against her hair. His voice was a vow, a new vow, forged in the wreckage of the old one.
Beck.
The syndicate.
The past.
All of it. I will burn it all before I let it touch you. June, you can't fight Beck alone. He has. I am not alone. His arms tightened. The tattoo on his chest pressed against her cheek. Not anymore. For a moment, in the quiet hammock with the rain on the roof and the documents of their shared destruction scattered around them, the world was still. The war was paused. The grief was shared. And 2 people who had been destroyed by the same spider sat in the wreckage and chose, for the first time, to heal instead of hide. Then the window shattered. The tear gas canister rolled across the ondal floor, hissing white smoke into the small room. Blessing screamed. Joon-Okoye moved with the speed of a man whose body remembered violence the way other men's bodies remembered breathing. He tackled her to the ground, covering her with his body, his hand pressing her face into his chest to shield her from the gas. Stay down, he snarled. Gunfire erupted outside. The sharp, staccato crack of automatic weapons tearing through the Buckshin night. Shouts in Korean. the sound of glass breaking in the adjacent rooms. Beck's men had found them. Joon-Okoye's phone buzzed against his hip. He answered it with one hand while keeping Blessing pinned beneath him with the other. "Status," he barked. 12 hostiles. Director Park's voice crackled through the speaker, tight and controlled. "Beck's elite unit. They breached the perimeter 90 seconds ago. We have 4 operatives on site. Outnumbered 3-1. Extract Blessing. Now." "Sir, the extraction route is compromised. They've blocked the eastern alley." "Then open the western route." "With what, sir?" "We're pinned down." Joon-Okoye's jaw tightened. The tattoo on his neck pulsed with the adrenaline flooding his system. He looked down at Blessing. Her eyes were wide, terrified, streaming with tears from the gas. Her lips were moving, forming words he could not hear over the gunfire. He made a decision that would cost him everything.
"Park," he said.
"Activate Protocol Sovereign." Silence on the line. "Then, sir, Protocol Sovereign will expose every asset, every safe house, every financial channel you have. Beck will have access to your entire network within the hour. It will take years to rebuild." "I said activate it, sir. If anything happens to her, there will be no empire to rebuild. Do you understand me?" His voice dropped to the register that made billionaires flinch and ministers stutter. "Burn it. Burn all of it. Just get her out." "Understood." The line went dead. Joon-Okoye hauled Blessing to her feet. He ripped the curtain from the window, wrapped it around her face as a makeshift gas mask, and dragged her toward the back of the hammock. The smoke was thickening. His eyes burned. His lungs screamed. But his grip on her hand was iron, the ooly spirals on his fingers pressing into her skin like a brand of protection. They burst through the back door into the narrow alley. Rain hit them like a wall. 2 of Beck's men were waiting, their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind tactical masks. Joon-Okoye did not slow down. He released Blessing's hand, stepped forward, and moved through the 2 gunmen with a fluidity that was not human but architectural, the precise, devastating geometry of a man who had been trained to kill before he was trained to read. The first man's weapon was redirected into the wall. The second man's knee was shattered with a kick that echoed off the stone buildings. Both men were on the ground in 4 seconds. He turned back to Blessing. His face was streaked with rain and gas residue. The tattoo on his collarbone was visible through the torn shirt, the tiger's eye blazing. "Run," he said. She ran. They sprinted through the Buckshin alleys, their footsteps splashing through puddles, the gunfire behind them fading as Director Park's operatives engaged Beck's remaining men. The extraction vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows and reinforced doors, appeared at the end of the alley like a mirage. The door flew open. Joon-Okoye shoved Blessing inside, and Devon after her. The SUV tore through the Seoul streets, its engine roaring, its suspension absorbing the impacts of corners taken too fast. Blessing pressed against the leather seat, gasping, her ribs screaming, her vision blurred with tears and gas residue. Joon-Okoye sat beside her, his chest heaving, blood trickling from a cut above his left eyebrow. The tattoo on his wrist was smeared with rain and grime. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his jaw locked, his entire body radiating the controlled fury of a man who had just declared war on the most powerful shadow figure in Asia. "Protocol Sovereign," Blessing gasped. "What did you do?" "I detonated my own empire," he said, his voice flat. "Every financial channel, every safe house, every intelligence network I've built over the last decade. It's all exposed. Beck's hackers are already inside my systems." "Why?" He turned to look at her. Blood dripped from his eyebrow onto his cheekbone, tracing the sharp line of his face like a tear made of violence. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made the air in the SUV feel pressurized. "Because you are worth more than all of it," he said. "Every shipping route, every syndicate connection, every dollar. You are worth more than the empire I built on the grave of my old life. And I will not spend another 7 years mourning something I destroyed out of fear." Blessing stared at him. The words settled into her chest like embers, hot and glowing and impossible to extinguish. "June," she whispered. "Don't," he said. His voice cracked. Don't thank me. Don't soften. I need you to stay angry at me for sending you into the rain. I need you to stay sharp. Because Beck will not stop. He will come for you again. And next time, I will not have an empire to sacrifice. Then we fight him without one. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The soft, expressive eyes. The natural elegance even in a torn, gas-stained catering uniform. The quiet strength in her posture that had not broken despite cracked ribs and a burned cafe and a father's legacy of destruction. You are extraordinary, he said. The words seemed to surprise him, as though they had escaped before his control could catch them. I'm a baker, she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. You are the woman I broke my vow for, he said. And I would break it again. 1,000 times. In every lifetime. The SUV disappeared into the Seoul night, carrying two broken people toward a war they could not win alone but refused to lose together. 2 weeks later, the safe house in Jeju Island smelled of salt air and desperation. Joon-Okoye stood at the window of the coastal villa, his hands clasped behind his back, his reflection fractured by the morning light on the glass. The tattoo on his neck was visible above the collar of his black shirt, the tiger, the uli spiral, the ink. That had once symbolized invincibility and now symbolized something far more dangerous, vulnerability. His empire was in ruins. Protocol Sovereign had done its work with devastating efficiency. Beck's hackers had dismantled the Han Joon-Okoye network in 72 hours, seizing shipping routes, freezing accounts, and turning Joon-Okoye's own lieutenants against him with promises of power and survival. Director Park was the only one who had remained loyal, and even Park's loyalty was being tested by the reality of their situation. They had no money, no network, no allies. Just a villa on a volcanic island, a handful of loyal operatives, and a woman who was sleeping in the next room with her father's documents clutched to her chest like a talisman. Joon-Okoye had not slept in 4 days. He spent the nights pacing the villa's perimeter, his phone pressed to his ear, negotiating with contacts who no longer returned his calls. He spent the mornings reviewing the intelligence Park had managed to salvage, fragments of Beck's operation, whispers of a meeting scheduled in Seoul, rumors of a deal that would cement Beck's control over the entire Korea-Africa corridor. And he spent every waking moment thinking about Blessing. She was healing. Her ribs were mending. The bruises had faded to faint shadows beneath her skin. She had taken over the villa's small kitchen and filled it with the smell of chin-chin and fried plantain, recreating the flavors of her Lagos childhood with ingredients she somehow managed to source from the island's markets. The act of baking seemed to anchor her, to give her a sense of control in a life that had been stripped of it. But he saw the fear in her eyes when she thought he was not looking. The way her hands trembled when a car backfired on the coastal road. The way she woke at 3 in the morning, gasping, her fingers clutching the sheets as though the bed were a raft in a storm. She was surviving. But survival was not living. He knew that better than anyone. The door behind him opened. Blessing walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She wore one of his shirts. It hung to her knees, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, the collar exposing the delicate line of her throat. The sight of her in his clothing did something to his chest that he had stopped trying to name. You haven't slept, she said, handing him a cup. Her voice was quiet, carrying the gentle authority of a woman who had learned to care for people who refused to care for themselves. Sleep is a luxury. Sleep is a biological necessity. Even for sovereigns. The corner of his mouth twitched. The closest thing to a smile he had produced in 7 years. The tattoo on his wrist flexed as he took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric as it always was, a current that ran from his skin to his spine to the place behind his ribs where the vow used to live. Park called, he said, his expression sobering. Beck is making his move. He's scheduled a summit in Seoul, a public gathering of every syndicate leader, every corrupt official, every power broker in the Korea-Africa network. He's going to announce his takeover of my former territories. He wants to legitimize his control. When? 3 days from now. The Lotte World Tower. Blessing's eyes widened. The same tower where we met. The same tower. He set the coffee down. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. He's invited me.
Publicly.
He wants me to attend, to kneel, to acknowledge his supremacy in front of the entire network. If I refuse, he'll kill everyone I have left. If I attend, he'll destroy me publicly and take everything. And if you attend and fight? He has 200 armed men in that building. I have 4 operatives and a baker. Blessing raised an eyebrow. This baker has a cast-iron rolling pin and a very personal grudge. Despite everything, the ruined empire, the death threats, the weight of 7 years of grief pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force, Joon-Okoye laughed. It was a short, rough sound, unfamiliar in his throat, as though his body had forgotten the mechanics of joy and was relearning them in real time. You are impossible, he said. I'm Nigerian, she said. We are genetically incapable of surrender. He stepped closer. The air between them compressed, charged with the same gravitational pull that had existed since the moment she knelt in broken glass and looked up at him with defiance in her soft, expressive eyes. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I am going to that summit, he said quietly. And I am going to destroy Baek Min-suk in front of every person who ever doubted me. But I need you to stay here. I need you to be safe. I need...
No.
Blessing.
No.
She placed her hands over his, her fingers wrapping around his tattooed wrists. I am done being the woman who stays behind. I am done being the secret you protect while you fight alone. If you walk into that tower, I walk in with you. He will kill you. He already tried. He burned my cafe. He sent men to my home. He has been hunting me since the night I spilled champagne on his marble floor. Her eyes blazed with a fire that matched the tiger on his chest. I am not hiding anymore. He stared at her. The war inside him was visible, the instinct to protect her warring against the recognition that she was not fragile, that she had never been fragile, that her strength was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be governed by it. If you die, he said, his voice breaking, I will not survive it.
I need you to understand that. This is not the old vow.
This is not pride or control or fear. This is the truth. You are the only thing in this world that I cannot lose. And if Baek takes you from me, I will burn this planet to ash. The raw honesty of his words hit her like a physical force. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. She let him see them. Let him see the full, unguarded truth of her love, her fear, her desperate, stubborn refusal to let him face this alone. Then we make sure he doesn't take me, she whispered. He pulled her against him. His arms wrapped around her with a ferocity that was no longer desperation but devotion, the grip of a man who had found the one thing worth more than his empire, his pride, and his pain. The tattoo on his chest pressed against her cheek. The tiger's eye watched over them both. 3 days, he said against her hair. We have 3 days to prepare for the most dangerous night of our lives. Then we'd better start baking, she said. He pulled back and looked at her, confusion flickering across his sharp features. Baking? I have an idea, she said, and for the first time in weeks, her smile reached her eyes. And it involves the one thing Baek will never expect. The night of the summit, the Latte World Tower pierced the Seoul sky like a needle of light. The 76th floor ballroom, the same ballroom where Blessing had once balanced a tray of canapés and shattered a champagne flute, was transformed into a theater of power. 200 of Asia's most dangerous men and women sat at circular tables draped in black silk, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of crystal chandeliers. Armed guards lined every wall. Surveillance cameras tracked every movement. The air smelled of expensive cologne and imminent violence. Baek Min-suk sat at the center table, his silver hair immaculate, his smile the practiced warmth of a man who had killed more people than he had invited to dinner. He raised a glass of soju and addressed the room with the casual authority of a king addressing his court. Tonight, we celebrate a new era, he said, his voice smooth as oil. The Han Joon-Okoye network, once the pride of the Korea-Africa corridor, has been absorbed into my organization. Its assets, its routes, its intelligence, all of it now serves a unified vision. A vision of stability, of order, of... The ballroom doors opened. Every head turned. Every hand moved toward a concealed weapon. The guards tensed. Han Joon-Okoye walked in. He was alone. No security detail. No operatives. No visible weapons. He wore a suit of midnight blue, the first time anyone had seen him in a color other than black, and his shirt was open at the collar, the full tapestry of his tattoos exposed to the room. The tiger on his chest. The uli spirals on his wrists. The Hanja characters on his neck that no longer read never again but had been replaced, in fresh ink, with a single Korean word. Forever. The room erupted into whispers. Beck's smile faltered for the first time in a decade. Joon-Okoye, Beck said, his voice carrying the forced warmth of a host greeting an uninvited guest. How generous of you to attend. I was beginning to think you had fled the country. I was busy, Joon-Okoye said. His voice was quiet, unhurried, and carried to every corner of the ballroom with the acoustic precision of a man who understood that power did not require volume. Dismantling your operation from the inside. The whisper stopped. The silence was absolute. Beck's smile vanished. That is not possible. Your network is destroyed. Your assets are frozen. You have nothing. I had nothing, Joon-Okoye corrected. He reached into his jacket and produced a USB drive, holding it up between his tattooed fingers. Until I realized that the one thing you never accounted for was the daughter of the man you used to destroy me. The ballroom doors opened again. Blessing John walked in. She was not wearing a catering uniform. She was wearing a gown of deep emerald green, the color of Lagos, the color of her mother's silk, the color of the life she had lost and was now reclaiming. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in dark waves. Her eyes were steady, her posture regal, her chin lifted with the quiet defiance that had cracked Joon-Okoye's armor on the night they met. In her hands, she carried a leather portfolio. Good evening, she said, her voice clear and carrying the melodic cadence of a woman who had once commanded ballrooms in Lagos and was now commanding one in Seoul. My name is Blessing John. My father was Emeka John. And I have evidence that every single person in this room has been manipulated, exploited, and betrayed by the man sitting at the center table. She opened the portfolio. Documents spilled across the nearest table, financial records, intercepted communications, surveillance photographs, and Emeka's final letter, reproduced in high resolution. The evidence of Beck's decades-long conspiracy, compiled from her father's hidden files and cross-referenced with the intelligence Joon-Okoye's remaining operatives had salvaged from the wreckage of his empire. The room detonated. Syndicate leaders lunged for the documents. Guards shouted into earpieces. Beck's face went the color of ash. He stood, his chair crashing backward, his hand reaching for the weapon inside his jacket. Kill them both, he screamed. The guards moved. But they did not move toward Joon-Okoye and Blessing. They moved toward Beck. Director Park emerged from the shadows near the service entrance, his earpiece glowing, his weapon trained on Beck's chest. Behind him, a dozen operatives, men and women who had been embedded in Beck's organization for months, placed there by Joon-Okoye before Protocol Sovereign, before the empire fell, before the vow broke, revealed themselves simultaneously, their weapons drawn, their loyalty absolute. You miscalculated, Joon-Okoye said to Beck, his voice carrying the quiet devastation of a man delivering a death sentence. You believed that destroying my empire would destroy me. You believed that killing Emeka John would bury the truth. You believed that his daughter was a loose end to be eliminated. He stepped forward, the tattoo on his chest blazing under the chandelier light. But you forgot one thing.
What?
Beck snarled, his composure shattered, his eyes wild with the realization that his empire was dissolving around him in real time. You forgot that the people you destroy do not stay dead, Joon-Okoye said. They come back. And they bring proof. Blessing stepped forward. She stood beside Joon-Okoye, her hand finding his, her fingers threading through his tattooed knuckles. The uli spirals pressed against her skin. The tiger watched from his chest. The word forever gleamed on his neck. My father was not a traitor, she said, her voice steady, her eyes blazing. He was a victim. Your victim. And his death will not be the end of the story. It will be the beginning of yours. Beck lunged. His weapon cleared his jacket. The gunshot echoed through the ballroom like a thunderclap. Joon-Okoye moved. He threw himself in front of Blessing with a speed that defied physics, his body absorbing the impact of the bullet in his left shoulder. The force spun him sideways. Blood sprayed across the marble floor, the same marble where Blessing had once knelt in broken glass, the same marble where their story had begun. Blessing screamed. Park's operatives opened fire. Beck's body crumpled. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Shouting, gunfire, the shattering of crystal, the collapse of a decade of shadow power in the span of 30 seconds. But Blessing heard none of it. She was on her knees beside Joon-Okoye, her hands pressing against his shoulder, her emerald gown soaking red with his blood. His face was pale. His breathing was shallow. The tattoo on his chest, the tiger, the Uli spirals, the ink that marked him as a man who had conquered everything except his own mortality, was smeared with crimson. "June," she sobbed. "June, stay with me. Stay." His eyes found hers. Dark. Piercing. Still burning with the fire that had drawn her to him from the moment she looked up from the broken glass. "I promised," he whispered, blood on his lips, his hand reaching up to touch her face. The tattoo on his wrist pressed against her cheek, warm, alive, sacred. "I promised I would never love again." "I know," she wept. "I lied." His fingers traced her jawline, her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth. His voice was fading, but his eyes were not. They were brighter than she had ever seen them, as though the bullet had released something inside him that 7 years of control had kept imprisoned. "I love you, Blessing. I have loved you since the moment you defied me in a ballroom full of cowards. I love you more than my empire, more than my pride, more than my life. Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely, pressing harder against the wound. "Don't you dare die on me, Han Joon-Okoye. I did not survive my father's death and your exile and Beck's assassins to lose you on the same marble floor where we met." His mouth twitched. A smile. A real smile. Fragile and luminous and utterly devastating on a face that had forgotten how to wear one. "Stubborn woman," he breathed. "Nigerian woman," she corrected, tears streaming down her face. "We don't surrender." The paramedics arrived. The ballroom was secured. Beck's network was collapsing in real time as the evidence spread through every encrypted channel in the Korea-Africa corridor. The syndicate leaders who had gathered to celebrate his triumph were now scrambling to distance themselves from his legacy, their loyalty dissolving faster than the blood on the marble floor. But in the center of the chaos, none of it mattered. Blessing held Joon-Okoye's hand and refused to let go. 6 months later, the cafe on the corner of Itaewon's busiest street smelled of chin-chin and fresh espresso and the particular warmth of a space that had been built from ash and stubbornness. The terracotta walls were new. The espresso machine was new. The hand-painted sign above the door, Blessing's Kitchen, was new. But the recipes were old, carried across an ocean and through a war, and into a life that had been rebuilt from the ground up. Blessing stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She was arranging a display of meat pies when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up. Han Joon-Okoye stood in the doorway. He was different. The sharpness was still there, the jawline, the piercing eyes, the controlled stillness that made strangers instinctively step aside. But the coldness was gone. The permafrost that had encased him for 7 years had melted, replaced by something warmer, something that lived in the slight softening of his expression when his eyes found hers, something that lived in the way he walked toward her with his hands open instead of clenched. The scar on his left shoulder was visible through the open collar of his linen shirt, a puckered star of healed tissue where Beck's bullet had entered. The tattoo on his chest was still there, the tiger's eye watching from over his heart. But the Hanja characters on his neck had changed again. They no longer read forever. They read home. "You're late," Blessing said, her lips curving into a smile that she no longer had to fight. "I was negotiating the Lagos shipping corridor," he said, leaning against the counter. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying the faintest trace of warmth that only she could detect. Director Park insists on handling the details, but I find that micromanagement is the only language our West African partners respect. Micromanagement is not a love language. No, he agreed, his dark eyes holding hers. This is. He reached across the counter and pulled her toward him by the strings of her apron. His lips met hers, gently, deliberately, with the unhurried devotion of a man who had learned that the most powerful thing in the world was not control but surrender. The tattoo on his wrist pressed against her hip, the scar on his shoulder stretched beneath his shirt. The cafe smelled of flour and coffee and the particular sweetness of a life that had been earned through blood and fire and the refusal to let go. When they parted, blessing rested her forehead against his. The vow, she whispered. Do you still think about it? Every day, he said. His thumb traced her cheekbone, his touch reverent, his eyes carrying the weight of everything they had survived. I think about the man I was when I made it. The grief, the rage, the absolute certainty that love was a weapon I could never survive again. And now I know the truth. He pressed his lips to her forehead. The tattoo on his neck, home, gleamed in the morning light. Love is not a weapon. It is a wound. And wounds are proof that you survived something worth surviving. Blessing closed her eyes. Her hand covered his, her fingers threading through the ooly spirals on his knuckles. Outside the cafe, Seoul hummed with the energy of 10 million lives moving in directions they could not predict. The Han River glittered in the distance. The Lotte World Tower pierced the sky, its 76th floor gleaming with the memory of broken glass and shattered vows, and the moment a catering girl looked up at a billionaire and changed the trajectory of both their lives. I love you, she said. 3 words. Simple. Unbreakable. I know, he said. And for the first time in his life, the silent sovereign smiled, fully, openly, without restraint, and let himself be loved by the only woman he could not lose. The cafe bell chimed again. A customer walked in. The espresso machine groaned. The morning light poured through the windows and illuminated the terracotta walls and the flour-dusted counter and the 2 people standing behind it, their hands intertwined, their scars visible, their story written in ink and blood, and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to let the past dictate the future. He had promised never to love her. She had become the only woman he couldn't lose. And in the end, the promise and the breaking of it were the same thing, proof that some vows are made to be shattered, and some loves are forged in the fire of everything that tried to destroy them. The tiger watched from his chest. The woolly spirals curled around his wrists. The word home rested on his neck. And Blessing John, the baker, the survivor, the daughter of a man who had been used and destroyed and erased, stood in the cafe she had built from ash and smiled at the man who had once told her to disappear. She was not invisible anymore. Neither was he. Thank you for experiencing this story of obsession, betrayal, sacrifice, and a love that refused to die. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more Afro-Korean dark romance narratives. Until next time.